All right, so we start a new recording and go back. Okay, so of course I would like to begin by honouring the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. We're all on different land. You might like to put in the chat box the land that you are on and acknowledge the traditional owners past, present and emerging of your land. As I mentioned to some of you earlier, I am on the land of the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And in fact, Parramatta was a very significant place for many Aboriginal people for long before settlement. It was a place of meeting and a place where they would often gather and eat the eels that used to congregate around here as well. So it's a very special site to them, and it's an honour to be able to live on their land. Thank you for those acknowledgements that are coming through. So today I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to climate anxiety and how we might provide pastoral care in that context. I should probably say first up, I am not claiming to be an expert in this area. I'm not trained in psychology, but I have come to a real passion and interest in this area because of my own experiences of climate anxiety and the climate anxiety that I'm seeing in so many of my friends and family and the people that I work with as the reality of climate change becomes increasingly obvious to us. So I think this is a really important topic for us to be talking about, and for us to be talking about as the church, because this is a pastoral issue. Firstly, my name is Jessica Morthorpe. I'm one of our Uniting Earth advocates. So I work for Uniting, our social services organisation, and I'm part of the Uniting Advocacy team. So our main campaigns are around fair treatment, housing and homelessness, refugees and asylum seekers, and climate. So I'm one of our staff working on climate, just to give you some context. So firstly, I wanted to invite you to share with each other what climate anxiety have you experienced or seen? So this might be your own feelings, it might be a friend or family member or church member that you've seen. What kind of feelings are you hearing people express about climate change? Okay, thank you so much for sharing those stories and those experiences. And it's always interesting to ask that question in a room and to find that more and more everybody has either personal or people close to them experiences of climate anxiety of different varieties. And so, yeah, this is becoming an ever-growing issue. And it's really quite a concern. Hi, John, thanks for joining us. So I'll go back to the slides, but you're all A students, so I think you're going to understand a lot of this already. So I thought we would start by looking at some of the basics. So what is climate anxiety and mental health? And why does it matter to churches? So basically, a lot of us start feeling anxiety when we start looking at some of the science and start looking at some of the things that are happening around us in the world at the moment. So some of you might have seen this famous climate stripe graph, which is showing the change in global average temperatures from 1918 to 2018. And I love this one because it just makes the pattern so very clear. It's really obvious from the way this is set up what is happening. This graph I stole from Jason, who just joined the call. And I'm not going to get into all of the science and all of the maths today, but I just wanted to point out from this where we're kind of at. There's the business of usual, as usual, and there's the Paris pledges, but then there's also what we actually need to be doing in terms of our carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions if we were going to stay within the 1.5 degree range of change and try and have a safer planet, particularly for the Pacific. They're going to be really affected by the changes very soon, and already, in fact. So yeah, seeing this kind of science often starts making people feel really quite anxious and really quite worried about the future. And so this was an important UNICEF study that was done of children and young people across Australia. And it found that 59% of children and young people view climate change as a threat to their safety. So almost 60% of our young people are actively feeling threatened that they won't be safe because of climate change, which of course translates into them being very, very keen on renewable energy. 88% are keen for us to move out of fossil fuels and towards renewables. It's also translating into a growing birth strike movement. So we've got 33.4% of Australian women under 30 having second thoughts about starting or expanding a family because of the unsafe future that they believe their children will have due to climate change. So, you know, these aren't minor anxieties. When you're starting to change decisions like whether you're going to have children or not around climate change, then this is really impacting you at a personal level, and it's really impacting your life and your decisions. So we need to be taking this really seriously. And even even when people do choose to have children, I've had ministers come to me and say, look, you know, I know this young couple and they've just had a baby and now they're freaking out. They're just really not coping with their climate anxiety because they're so worried about what kind of future this baby is going to have. Can you kind of recommend someone for them to talk to? We can also see the anxiety that people are feeling in the reactions to the global school strike for climate movement. So in September last year, we had 300,000 people marching in Australia, including about 80,000 in Sydney. And we were there, we organised the Uniting Church presence, and it was incredible. Like walking into the Domain and the roar of voices as you entered from all of the people that were there. And that was part of a movement globally of over 4 million students in 163 countries. So yeah, again, this is reflecting just how anxious our school-aged children are and how worried they are about the future, and also some of that frustration with the politicians that we were mentioning earlier. As I said, this is a really growing issue. So the Australian Psychological Society, their president has actually said that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And 1 in 5 Australians have experienced climate-related distress at some time. So psychologists are seeing this more and more in their practices. More and more people are coming to talk to them about different mental health issues related to climate and climate change. And if the psychologists are seeing it, then those of us in the church and in ministry are also already seeing it and going to see it more and more. So yeah, these bigger problems that affect society are also affecting us in the church. And I like this little picture because this is a little church in the Philippines, and it's being engulfed by seawater. So this is a church that's going under because of climate change already. And as we mentioned, for young people, their futures are on the line. So I had the privilege of going to talk to this group of young people in Orange from the Uniting Church school there. And, I'm really interested in this area. I'm often asking people to share their stories with me, but I was still really shocked to hear the level of concern of these young people, and to hear them kind of saying, I would like to go to uni and do X, Y, Z if climate change allows me to, if I can get to uni and have that important stage of life without kind of the world falling apart because of climate change. Like these people, young people, are really not sure how much of any of a future they're going to have. And I think that's shocking. And yeah, if we love our young people in the church, then we need to be helping them deal with this. And also, as has already come up in our conversations, we have a lot of church communities in Western New South Wales and around the country who have been suffering through really severe drought. And so there's a whole bunch of mental health issues that are arising in those communities as well. And the drought has been made worse by climate change. And of course, we can't believe what we have seen late last year, early this year, with these bushfires. The bushfire season started in August. It was completely extraordinary, the ferocity and the extent of the fires all across Australia. And the scary thing is that this might become a new normal, or at least it might become more frequent and more intense with climate change. So, and even those of us in the city, we're affected by the smoke, and over 400 people, it's just been revealed, died from smoke inhalation during this fire season. So none of us in Australia can escape the consequences of climate change anymore. It's here, it's in our faces, we've all experienced it. So now the question is, how we deal with it practically, politically, and psychologically. So what is unique about climate mental health, and how do we provide pastoral care for it? So just learning about climate change can create a whole bunch of emotional impacts. So I was talking to someone recently, and she was saying, her son started learning about climate change last term at school, and was really suffering from anxiety, and she had to spend the whole school holidays sort of trying to help her son to deal with those feelings. And now that they've gone back to school, what did they do? They started talking about climate change again. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about climate change at school. This is far too important to their futures for us not to be talking about it. But I am saying that we need to be aware of the potential impact of those discussions on their mental health, and make sure that they get the support that they need. So this awareness can lead to a whole bunch of things: stress, You know, we all experience stress, but long-term stress and intense stress can lead to a whole bunch of other issues like substance abuse, anxiety disorders, and depression. Anxiety, existential dread, loss of sleep, shutting down. So we were talking before about how some people kind of just can't handle it, and so they try and avoid the issue. So people who are shutting down, or who are experiencing what we call compassion fatigue, so just finding it too hard to care anymore. Another response is perfectionism. So some people start trying really, really hard to reduce their carbon footprint and to always be environmentally friendly. And if you're trying really hard to do that and your partner isn't, then that can become a real strain on relationships. And there are documented cases of relationships experiencing extreme strain from this. Depression, and reducing, again, this is an even more extreme version. So trying to find ways to reduce or essentially erase your own impact. So people who are trying to have no impact at all, even if that has a great cost to themselves. So one of the first examples of eco-anxiety that was recorded in the psychological literature was a young boy in Australia who, in light of the drought and everything, decided to stop drinking water. And he was so concerned about the drought that he was willing to stop drinking water, obviously with, you know, potentially very rapid and negative effects to his own health. But for some people, you know, these issues are so serious that it's driving them to that, or even climate suicide. You know, that can seem like an option for reducing your footprint. So some wider mental health impacts of climate change. Heat waves. It's actually really interesting how much heat waves affect us psychologically. And this one is quite important in cities as well, because cities absorb heat and become heat wells. And there's a lot of inequality here as well. Not everybody has the ability to pay for air conditioning. Not everybody has a well-insulated house that they can keep cool. And so these heat waves can kill people, do kill people, lots of people. And also they have some interesting flow-on psychological effects from things like, you know, when it's really, really hot outside, you tend to go out less. So you stay inside and you can become isolated and lose the connection that you need to feel mentally healthy. Natural disasters. Obviously, when we have one of these big disasters, like what we've just seen with the bushfires, you get huge increases in the rates of suicide, depression, and anxiety in response to those events. And in fact, it's so significant that they're having to develop a new field of mental health research and response to try and help people to deal with these extreme weather events. And as I kind of implied earlier, we're going to need more and more people who can help people with this, with these experiences, because unfortunately natural disasters are going to become more and more common. So we have climate and eco-anxiety, eco-grief, solastalgia, I'll explain that in a second, depression, existential dread, pre-traumatic stress disorder, and we also have vicarious trauma. So you might not be experiencing these mental health impacts yourself, but you might be hearing them from friends or family, or you might be a psychologist who's trying to treat people with these issues, and you might actually get vicarious trauma from that. And there's a whole bunch of authors at the moment trying to come up with some new words to explain some other kind of psychological problems that we're seeing coming out of climate change. So eco-anxiety, its simple definition is just this fear of seeing the world collapse and the resulting feeling of powerlessness. So powerlessness is a really key thing here as well. Solastalgia. So this is actually a word coined by the Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht. And if you came to our conference last year, we had Glenn come along. And it comes from the words for solace and longing. And basically it's talking about the distress that we feel at the destruction of the environment. So when we see a natural disaster, or we were talking about mining, when you see land clearing, it's those feelings that you have when you see that destruction, and it makes you feel sad and anxious about what is happening to our world. And we're also finding now that people are experiencing what they're calling pre-traumatic stress disorder. So we all know about post-traumatic stress disorder, when you've been through a really traumatic event. But in fact, this pre-traumatic stress disorder is about when we're obsessing over and unable to escape these awful thoughts about something that we think will happen in the future, rather than something that happened to us in the past. And so, yeah, people are experiencing this trauma and having these symptoms and everything, just thinking about what might come with climate change, or what they think will come with climate change, even though they haven't experienced it yet. So actually a really interesting case study in some of this is Greta Thunberg. So she's famous for the incredible way that she's inspired us all, but she's also an example of climate anxiety. So again, at school, she was shown some educational films about climate change and what is happening in the Arctic and to polar bears. And you know, some children can let that kind of thing go and others can't. She couldn't let it go. And essentially the pictures stuck in her head and started making her feel very depressed. She stopped going to school, she stopped eating, she stopped growing, and she spoke only to her family and one teacher. So she's just kind of had this complete withdrawal as a response to this information about climate change. But thankfully, as we know, she took action. She actually managed to turn her depression and anxiety into her original protest by herself. And then within less than a year, that had become a global movement. And so by being part of these big collective actions, by feeling like she's making a difference, she's actually been able to largely recover. And so she says now that she's feeling happier, that she has a sense of meaning, and she has a sense of that she knows what she's doing. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting example of someone who had this severe climate anxiety reaction, but also now has been able to come through that through the actions that she's taken and through her involvement in climate advocacy. And there's a French author who's actually suggested that this kind of mourning and anxiety around what's happening to our planet, especially, you know, as it's becoming so in our face, that this might actually be a phase that we kind of all have to go through. And I would argue that it's a repeating phase. I don't think this is something you experience just once. I think you know, there might be an initial phase where you experience it really deeply, and then you sort of try and find some coping mechanisms. But I think it's going to come back in smaller or greater degrees over your life. And so, yeah, we as church communities need to be aware of that and need to be able to help people to deal with it every time it comes up, and particularly when it gets really difficult. So one of the tricky things about all of this, particularly from pastoral care point of view. So, you know, in the church, we have lots of people who are trained in pastoral care, and who kind of have some idea, at least, how to help people through the kinds of mental health issues that we see all the time. But climate-related mental health can be a little bit different. So this is a good example, anxiety versus climate anxiety. So anxiety is something that we might be familiar with. We might say, okay, I kind of know how to talk to someone through their experience of anxiety. But then what you do with that might not necessarily work for climate anxiety. So the key difference with this one, for example, is that climate anxiety is a completely rational response to what is happening in the world. So normally with anxiety, we kind of catastrophize a bit, and we blow things up in our minds, and we see them as bigger than they are. And so, you know, when we're working with that, we often sort of try and help people to think through that, and, you know, is this actually going to happen? And, you know, what are some more positive thoughts that we can have about the future and about what we're worried about? But as I say, if you look at the science, if you look at the data, it is completely understandable to be anxious about climate anxiety. We should never be dismissing or minimizing the feelings that people are having about this. Not that we ever should, for any anxiety. But, you know, people are having rational responses here. And so we need to acknowledge that, and we need to be careful of that when we're providing pastoral care for climate anxiety. So how can we help? We need to learn and be prepared. We need to actually talk about the difference between climate anxiety and other forms of anxiety. And we need to know how that uniqueness is going to affect our pastoral care practice. And we need to be prepared for the natural disasters and how we're going to help people through that. We need to help by listening. We need to be creating forums where people can actually share how they're feeling. We need to help through collaboration and action. As we saw with Greta, these are really, really powerful in helping people to turn around how they're feeling. We need to talk about it, and we need to talk about how it's happening now, not just in the future. So there's still a bit of a tendency in a lot of our discourse to suggest that climate change is a future thing, or, you know, I'm really worried about my children or my grandchildren. We kind of need to be worried about ourselves as well, because it's happening right now, as we saw in the bushfires this year. We need to address the issue, and we need to help people to work through the facts. We need to build agency. Agency is really important. Agency allows people to feel that they can make a change, and that we can, you know, take action on climate change and actually create a more positive trajectory for ourselves and for the world. So, you know, yes, all of the science is terrifying, but every degree that we can keep the planet from warming, so every amount of CO2 that we can not release into the atmosphere and that can not be driving global warming is actually helpful. So, you know, our actions do make a difference. Yeah, there's some really interesting psychology around this agency stuff, and just how big an impact it has on people. So I was reading a thing the other day that was talking about how if a person in a kind of thought experiment, if a person sees a child drowning in front of them, you know, obviously you save the child. But if the person sees a child in front of them drowning and a child just down, like too far for them to get to, so a few k's down the road or in another country or something, drowning, and they can see that both children are drowning and they can see the consequences if they don't help, but there's only one that they can realistically get to, there's only one that they have agency to help, they're actually more likely to not even help the one that's close, to not even help the child that they can get to, because they know even if they save the child that's close to them, the child that's far away from them is still going to die. So that kind of awareness of agency or lack of agency actually really, really changes our behavior and how we respond to a situation. So we need to be always working really, really hard to make people feel that they can make a change, and that they can achieve something and save the child, because that means that they're going to be far more effective advocates, and then together we can make a real change and help the planet. We need to show our love for our young people. This stuff's really heavy, and our young people shouldn't be having to carry it alone. Again, I'm grateful to Greta because she often speaks up on this and often kind of says, you know, this is completely unfair. You've stolen my childhood. I should not be having to carry this as a child. None of us should. We should not have to be, you know, having giant protests all around the world, because the adults should be doing their job of loving and protecting us, so that we don't have to. And yeah, so I think there's some frustration and anger in our young people, and we need to show them that we're acting, and in doing so show that we love them. We need to teach good eco-theology and good theodicy. So we need to be talking about, and we talked about this a bit earlier, you know, we need to be talking about how God does actually love and care for this creation, and that is church teaching, and that is important to us, particularly as Uniting Church people. We have a long history in this area of some really great eco-theology statements, but we need to make sure that everybody knows that, and that we're teaching it well to our people and to our young people. And we need good theodicy, so the theology around pain and suffering. You know, if people are going to be dealing with pain and suffering, and they're going to want to know if God is with them in that, and we want to be hopefully saying, you know, helpful and good things to them that actually help them with that pain and suffering rather than making it worse. And bad theodicy, I think, can quite easily make it worse. Another thing you can do to help is just be someone in your community that people can talk to about climate anxiety. So, you know, talk about your own experiences or the experiences of those close to you. Make sure that people know that if they're going through this, you're actually someone that they can talk to. Because otherwise we tend to keep it to ourselves. As I said when we were sharing, you know, every time I've done this with a room of people, everyone's had something to share. But I wonder how many of those stories have ever been shared before I asked the question, before I invited that sharing. So where are we creating those spaces for people to share? And perhaps most important, please come to our conference this year. So this, the the large focus of this conference will be around climate anxiety and pastoral care. So this workshop today is just a little bit of an intro, just a taster to hopefully whet your appetite. But as I said, I am not in any way an expert in this area. I'm just interested. So what I've done is set up this conference for you where the experts will be there, where the people who are the psychologists with entire pages worth of degrees, they will be there, and they will be able to answer your questions and give you their professional perspectives and information on the issue. We will also have some key, really awesome speakers on climate communication, so how to talk about these issues, and also on church climate action. So how can we take all of this and turn it into action and doing something together collaboratively as a church. So it's an online event this year, thanks to COVID and everything. The advantage of that is that all of you country people don't need to travel to Sydney to come. You can just log in. And also you can invite your friends from all around Australia, maybe even all around the world if you like, as long as they can log in for the times that the sessions are. There's really no restrictions this year, which is awesome. So the main sessions will be on the Thursday night, so July the 30th, it will be an evening from 7 till 9. On Friday the 31st of July, it will be an afternoon session, so we'll start with a virtual lunch at 12 and we'll run till 6. And then on Saturday the 1st of August, we'll be running on the Saturday morning. So it's not the full 3 days, but that's kind of how it's going to run, just so you have that information. And registrations are now open, so you can go through there. Registration is very cheap. It's only $30 for the whole conference. So yeah, please register and please come along and hear from these amazing experts who are giving up their time for free so that they can teach us and so that the church can be equipped in these areas. To end on a nice positive note, how is the Uniting Church taking action on climate and what can you do? So as I mentioned, our Uniting Church has a long history of concern for creation. So our basis of union, our foundational document, talks about how the church's call is to serve God's goal of the coming reconciliation and renewal of the whole creation. So I read that as actually our purpose as church is to serve God's goal and God's idea of this reconciliation and renewal of all creation. That's actually why we exist. So of course, caring for the environment is a huge part of that. And we even talked about the wise use of energy, the protection of the environment and future generations in our 1977 statement to the nation. So again, when we declared to the world who we were as the Uniting Church, as this baby church, we said that this was part of what was going to be really important to us. And so we're continuing to try and be faithful to that in the way that we participate in our climate advocacy. So this is a picture from the September 20 global climate strike last year. And that's a picture of the Sydney Domain, you know, when I mentioned the roar as I entered. And part of this was possible because at Synod in last year, we actually passed a resolution around a Synod climate action strategy. So we said that we were going to develop this strategy to reduce emissions across all parts of our church. We said that we were going to advocate to all levels of government to reduce their emissions, and that we were going to support the initiatives of our young people in advocating for action. So the work that we did towards the global school strike for climate and our participation in that, and we had over 300 Uniting Church people just in Sydney who participated in that, and many groups in rural areas all throughout our synod. That was part of this Synod Climate Action Strategy. We also held a reference group meeting in December last year where we got together 50 people who were passionate about the environment and wanted to contribute to this Synod Climate Action Strategy. And so we got together and we talked about how we were going to implement the strategy and what we were going to do. And so we came up with 5 task groups. So these are all volunteer task groups of members of the Synod, and they're working on these different areas to progress them. And if you're interested in joining any of these task groups, we would love to have you. Most of them are, all of them at the moment, are meeting by Zoom or have that capacity. So it shouldn't matter where you're located. So we have one that's around synod agencies, boards and schools emissions reduction. We have one that's around reducing the emissions of churches and individual members. We have our advocacy one, and as I mentioned, their key campaign is our Cities Power Partnership. So basically asking your council to sign up to a program with the Climate Council where they take different actions to reduce their emissions within their council area. And this is really, really powerful because actually there's quite a bit that councils can do. And if we get hundreds of councils all across New South Wales ACT signing up to this, then that's a strong indicator to our state and federal governments that people really want to see action happening. We have our climate anxiety and pastoral care group and our mass actions, including particularly organising the school strikes group. So I've kind of pre-shadowed myself a bit here, but yeah, so when we look at the synod and agency emissions reduction, so we're looking at the really big hitters within our synod, who is really making the emissions, and how can we try and reduce those within the organisation. So as you can see, Uniting Care is by far our largest emitter, but actually if you could add up all of the individuals, all of our members within our churches, then their collective carbon footprint would be much, much higher, which is why we have this second group, which is looking at how we can reduce our church and individual emissions. And 2 particular projects of this group are looking at the 5-leaf Eco Awards as a way for churches to get involved in becoming more environmentally friendly, and the Living the Change program, which is a pledge program where people are invited to commit to reducing their transport, food or energy footprint. And yeah, so if we can get thousands of our members to sign up to that, that will make a really big difference. Advocacy, as I said, we've got this partnership with the Climate Council, which is one of the leading climate communications organisations in the country, around getting our towns and cities to step up and take some leadership. We've got our mass actions group, and we've just had our big, our most recent big event on May 15. So hopefully you all saw some of the resources and events that we did around that. And our climate anxiety and pastoral care group, which is possibly the one of most interest to all of you. And so we've got a couple of different projects that we're doing as a group. So we're organising the conference that I mentioned, and we're also working on putting together a climate conversation resource. So basically this will be a resource for just average people in congregations to take and use to start a conversation about climate anxiety and mental health within their community. So you don't need to be a psychologist, don't need to have any particular background. You're just creating that safe space for people to share how they're feeling, and to allow people to feel less alone and more like we're in this together. And we've also produced a personal reflection video. So this is available on YouTube, and it's prayer-based. So it's just a chance to, oops, no, don't start. Just a chance to go through, say the prayers, and think for yourself a bit about how you're feeling, and how you might want to take that to God and ask for some help. This is another resource that we've just put together, and the wonderful Ruth Wyvell has just helped me to collect some ideas and some philosophy, in fact, around helping kids to connect with nature. And really, all of this applies to adults as well as kids. But we, with COVID, were particularly people were asking us about, how can I help my grandkids to connect with nature to help them deal with some of the stress they're feeling and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of great ideas in here, and also just some really powerful things to think about, because these connections with nature are so important to our mental health. How to learn more. So as I mentioned, come to the conference, number one. You can also find out more from our website, unitingearth.org.au. And there's lots of different resources on there. And feel free to contact Jason and I as well if you have questions about specific things, or you'd like to be pointed to a particular resource. We're always happy to help you out. And I just wanted to mention as well that our advocacy team have been running a few of these skills workshops. So I don't think we've got any more scheduled at the moment, but I'm sure we would be quite happy to run one in your area if you think you've got a few people that you could get together who would like to learn skills like how to meet your MP or how to write a letter to your MP, and yeah, skill yourself up to take action in this area. And so I like to give the last word to Greta, and I think this is a fantastic quote from her. We do need hope, of course we do, but the one thing that we need more than hope is action. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So that was one of the things that I really learned from the climate pastoral care training last year, that one of the best ways to find hope, that one of the best ways to help ourselves with the climate anxiety that we're feeling is to actually take action, and particularly to take action together. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that we can find ways to work together and to channel our anxiety into some really positive advocacy and action that makes the world a better place. Okay.